Hey guys, tonight we are beginning the complete story of Moses, from the riverbanks of Egypt to the edge of the Promised Land, from a child hidden in fear to a shepherd called from the fire, from a man who did not think he could speak to the servant through whom God would confront an empire. This is the story of Moses, and we are going to take it slowly. So get comfortable, take a breath, let the day go. Whatever is still moving around in your mind, whatever still feels unfinished, set it down for now. It will keep until morning. Tonight we are going back to ancient Egypt, to the Nile in the dark, to brick fields and store cities, to a people who had been in a foreign land for so long that the foreign land had begun to feel like the only world they had ever known. And yet God had not forgotten them. That is where the story begins. Not with Moses as a grown man, not with the staff in his hand, not with Pharaoh trembling under signs and wonders. The story begins before Moses knows anything at all, before he has a name, before he has a voice, before anyone looking at him could possibly know what his life would become. It begins with a people groaning under a burden too heavy to carry. The children of Israel had come down into Egypt generations earlier in the days of Joseph. They had come hungry, desperate, looking for grain during a famine that had emptied fields and silenced households across the ancient world. Egypt had bread. Egypt had storehouses. Egypt had Joseph, though his brothers did not know at first that the man standing over the grain was the brother they had sold years before. That story had ended, in a way, with forgiveness, with Jacob's family settled in the land of Goshen, with sheep and tents and children growing up under Egyptian skies. Joseph had risen high in Egypt, second only to Pharaoh, and because of him, his family had been protected. But Joseph died. His brothers died. That whole generation passed away, and the years kept moving, quiet and relentless, the way years always do. The children of Israel multiplied. They became fruitful and strong. Families became clans. Clans became tribes. A household became a nation before anyone quite knew what to call it. They were still living in Egypt, still speaking the names of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, still carrying stories of a land promised to their fathers. But Egypt was now the place where their children were born, and their children's children after them. Then a new king arose over Egypt. The scriptures say he did not know Joseph. That is a small sentence, but it carries the weight of an entire world changing. The memory that had protected Israel was gone from the throne. The gratitude that had once surrounded Joseph's family had faded into political suspicion. The new Pharaoh looked at the children of Israel, not as guests, not as descendants of the man who had saved Egypt from famine, but as a problem. There are too many of them, he thought. They are too strong. If war comes, they may join our enemies. Fear began to think like policy. And once fear becomes policy, ordinary people begin to suffer in ways that are planned and organized and justified by the people causing the suffering. So the Egyptians set taskmasters over the Israelites. They forced them into labor. They made them build store cities for Pharaoh, Pithom, and Ramses, brick by brick, day after day, under the sun, under the voices of men who carried whips and orders. The work was meant to weaken them, to break them, to make their growth slow down under the weight of exhaustion. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied. That is the strange and stubborn thing about this part of the story. Pharaoh pressed down, and life kept rising. He tightened his fist, and the people kept growing. He tried to make suffering a weapon against the promise, and the promise continued underneath it, unseen but alive. So the Egyptians became afraid of the Israelites, and their fear became cruelty. They made their lives bitter with hard service. Mortar, brick, field labor. The same movements repeated until backs ached and hands split and the body learned the shape of weariness. The days were not dramatic. That is one of the hardest parts of suffering like this. It becomes ordinary, morning after morning, the same dust, the same orders, the same ache, the same longing for rest. Israel cried out, but for a long time nothing seemed to change. Then Pharaoh gave a darker order. He spoke to the Hebrew midwives, women who helped children into the world, women whose work was supposed to stand at the doorway of life and welcome what God was giving. Their names were Shiphrah and Puah. Pharaoh told them that when Hebrew sons were born, they were to kill them. The daughters could live. The sons were to die. This is how afraid Pharaoh had become. A king on a throne was afraid of children who had not yet learned to open their eyes. But the midwives feared God. That is what the scriptures say, and it is enough. They feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. They knew that the king of Egypt could threaten them, punish them, perhaps even kill them. But they also knew that there was a king above Pharaoh, and that life belonged to him. So they did not do what Pharaoh commanded. They let the boys live. When Pharaoh asked why, they answered wisely, and the children continued to be born. The cry of newborn sons still rose in Hebrew homes. Mothers still held them. Fathers still whispered over them. The quiet courage of two women stood between Pharaoh's command and a generation of children. This is one of the first acts of resistance in the story of Moses, and Moses is not even born yet. Before the staff, before the sea, before the mountain, there are women who fear God more than they fear power. Then Pharaoh gave his command to all his people. Every son born to the Hebrews was to be cast into the Nile. The Nile, the river that made Egypt powerful, the river that watered fields and carried boats and shaped the rhythm of the land. The river that Egypt depended on for life was now being turned, by Pharaoh's command, into a place of death. And somewhere under that shadow, in a house belonging to the tribe of Levi, a child was born. His mother looked at him and saw that he was beautiful. Not simply beautiful the way all children are beautiful to the mothers who hold them. There was something about him, something that made hiding him feel not only like love, but like obedience. She knew the command. She knew the danger. She knew that if anyone heard him cry, if any Egyptian noticed, if fear entered the room in the shape of a soldier, the child could be taken from her arms. So she hid him. For 3 months she hid him. Think about that quietly. 3 months of trying to keep a newborn silent in a world listening for the sound of newborn Hebrew sons. 3 months of feeding him carefully, rocking him quickly, covering his cries, watching the doorway, listening for footsteps. 3 months of a mother's whole life narrowing around the fragile breath of one small child. But a baby grows. His lungs grew stronger. His cries carried farther. The hiding place that had been enough in the first weeks was not enough forever. His mother reached the terrible point where keeping him in the house was no longer safety. So she made a basket. The word used for it is rare, the same kind of word used for the Ark of Noah. A small vessel of rescue, covered with pitch, made to float where death had been commanded. She placed her son inside it. She carried him down to the river. She set the basket among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. Not out in the current, among the reeds. This was not abandonment without thought. It was a desperate act of faith shaped by a mother's careful hands. She put him where the water would hold him and the reeds would hide him. She did the only thing left to do, and then she stepped away from what she could no longer control. His sister stood at a distance. The scriptures do not name her here, but later we know her as Miriam. She watched to see what would happen to him. A young girl by the riverbank, old enough to understand danger, young enough that her presence might not draw the same suspicion. She stood where she could see the basket, where she could see the water, where she could see the future of her baby brother floating quietly among the reeds. Then Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe at the river. The daughter of the man who had commanded Hebrew boys to die came walking toward the place where one Hebrew boy was hidden. Her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman to bring it. The basket was opened. The child cried. And Pharaoh's daughter had pity on him. That cry saved his life. Not because the cry was powerful in itself. It was the ordinary cry of a frightened child. But God had placed that cry in front of the one Egyptian woman who, in that moment, would respond not with obedience to Pharaoh's cruelty, but with compassion. She knew what he was. "This is one of the Hebrews' children," she said. She knew. And still she had pity. Miriam stepped forward. This was courage too. Quick courage. Intelligent courage. She came near to Pharaoh's daughter and asked if she should go and call a Hebrew woman to nurse the child. Pharaoh's daughter said yes. So Miriam ran and called the child's own mother. The mother who had placed him in the basket that morning now received him back into her arms. Pharaoh's daughter told her to take the child and nurse him, and she would pay her wages. There is a quiet beauty in that reversal. The mother had given up her son to the river because Pharaoh had made Egypt unsafe for him. Now Pharaoh's own household was paying her to keep him alive. The command meant to destroy him had been turned, without Pharaoh knowing it, into the arrangement that preserved him. This is the way God often works in these stories, not always loudly at first, not always with fire from heaven, sometimes with timing, with a basket in the reeds, with a sister who knows when to speak, with compassion in the heart of someone raised inside the house of the oppressor, with a mother receiving back what she thought she had lost. The child grew. For a time, he lived again in the house of his mother. He heard the sounds of the Hebrew people. He felt the hands of the family that had risked everything to save him. His earliest world was not the palace. It was the house of slaves, the house of Levites, the house where the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was still remembered in whispers and prayers and stories passed from one generation to the next. Then the day came when he was taken to Pharaoh's daughter. She adopted him as her son. She named him Moses because she had drawn him out of the water. Drawn out. That name would follow him for the rest of his life. He had been drawn out of the Nile before he could understand what water was. And one day, through him, Israel would be drawn out of Egypt. His name held the shape of his calling before he could carry it. Moses grew up in the palace of Egypt. The scriptures move quickly here. They do not give us all the details we might wonder about. They do not tell us what his rooms looked like, who taught him, what he felt when he first understood that he was not like the Egyptians around him. They do not give us a full childhood. They give us enough. He was raised as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. That means he grew up near power, near ceremony, near gold and linen and carved stone, near the stories Egypt told about itself. He would have seen temples and processions, scribes with ink, soldiers in formation, administrators keeping accounts of grain and labor and tribute. He would have heard the language of command. He would have learned the habits of a court where every gesture meant something. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, his own people were making bricks. This is the tension at the center of Moses' early life. He belonged in two worlds and fully in neither. He was a Hebrew child who should have died under Pharaoh's decree, yet he was alive because Pharaoh's daughter had taken him in. He was raised in privilege, but his blood tied him to the people under the burden. He could walk through Egyptian spaces that other Hebrews could not enter. But the story of his birth did not disappear simply because the palace gave him another life. At some point, Moses knew. He knew who his people were. The scriptures do not describe the moment of discovery. Maybe there was no single moment. Maybe it came gradually, through stories half heard and faces recognized, through the quiet knowledge carried by servants, through the memory of his mother, through the difference between the world that raised him and the people whose suffering kept that world running. But when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens. That sentence matters. He went out. He looked. He did not remain at a safe distance inside the world that protected him. He went out to the place where the bricks were made and the backs were bent and the cries were not ceremonial but real. He looked on their burdens, not glanced, not noticed in passing. Looked, with attention, with the kind of seeing that refuses to let suffering stay abstract. And as he looked, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. One of his own people. The scripture says it plainly. Moses identified with the man being beaten, not with the Egyptian holding power in that moment, not with the palace that had raised him, but with the Hebrew under the blow. Something in Moses rose up. He looked this way and that. No one was there. Then he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. It was a violent act. It was not yet the deliverance of God. It was Moses acting in anger, perhaps in justice mixed with anger, perhaps in a confused attempt to become by force what he had not yet been called and shaped to become. He saw oppression, and he could not endure it. That much was right, but the way he responded would send him into exile. The next day he went out again. This time he saw two Hebrews struggling with one another. He asked the man in the wrong why he was striking his companion. And the man answered with words that cut directly into the hidden place Moses thought no one had seen. "Who made you a prince and judge over us?" Are you going to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Moses was afraid. What he had done in secret was known. The sand had not buried the story deeply enough. Pharaoh heard of it and sought to kill Moses. So Moses fled. The man drawn out of water now fled across dry places, out of Egypt, away from the palace, away from the people he had tried to defend, away from the only worlds he had ever known. He went east, into the land of Midian, carrying with him the wreckage of a life that had split open. This is one of the great silences in Moses' story. What did he think as he left Egypt behind him? Did he think he had ruined everything? Did he think the burden of Israel would continue forever? Did he think his moment of anger had closed the door on whatever purpose might once have been possible for him? The scriptures do not say. They let the silence remain. But we can see the shape of it. Moses was no longer a prince in Egypt. He was not a deliverer in Israel. He was a fugitive. And fugitives do not usually imagine that they are on the way to a calling. They imagine they are running from the life they lost. Moses came to the land of Midian and sat down by a well. A well is often a meeting place in the stories of Scripture. Abraham's servant found Rebekah at a well. Jacob met Rachel at a well. Wells were places where journeys paused and futures quietly changed. Water draws people together in dry lands, and God often arranges meetings where people come looking only for water. The priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water for their father's flock, but shepherds came and drove them away. Moses rose and helped them. This is worth noticing. He had fled Egypt because he struck down an oppressor. Now, in Midian, with no audience and nothing to gain, he saw people being pushed aside, and he acted again. This time not by killing, not by hiding a body in the sand, but by simple protection. He stood up for the vulnerable. He helped the daughters water their flock. The instinct had not disappeared. It only needed to be purified. The daughters returned home earlier than usual. Their father, Reuel, who is also called Jethro in the story, asked how they had come so quickly. They told him that an Egyptian had delivered them from the shepherds and had drawn water for them. An Egyptian. That is how Moses appeared to them. His clothing, his speech, his bearing, all of it still carried Egypt. He had left the palace, but the palace had not fully left him. He was a Hebrew by birth, Egyptian by upbringing, and now a stranger in Midian. Jethro told his daughters to call the man back. Moses came into the household of Jethro. He was content to dwell there. In time, Jethro gave him his daughter Zipporah as a wife. She bore him a son, and Moses named him Gershom because he said he had been a sojourner in a foreign land. A sojourner, a man living where he does not finally belong. That name tells us something about Moses' heart. He had found shelter. He had found work. He had found a wife and a household and a son. But underneath it all, he knew he was a stranger. Egypt was behind him. Israel was suffering without him. Midian held him, but it was not the final answer to who he was. Years passed. Not a few years. Many years. Moses became a shepherd. That is one of the quiet surprises of his story. The child saved from the Nile and raised in the house of Pharaoh became a keeper of sheep in the wilderness. The man who had known courts and power and the architecture of empire learned the slow life of flocks. He learned where water could be found. He learned the moods of the desert. He learned patience because sheep require patience. He learned silence because the wilderness gives silence in great measures. There is a kind of education that happens in palaces, and there is another kind that happens in wilderness. Moses needed both. Egypt had taught him how power speaks. Midian taught him how quiet God can be before he speaks. Egypt had shown him the machinery of oppression from the inside. Midian gave him 40 years of distance from his own strength. Egypt had formed a man capable of standing before Pharaoh. The wilderness formed a man who would know that standing before Pharaoh was not enough unless God was the one sending him. This is how God prepares people in Scripture, slowly, often in hidden places, often by taking them far from the place where their calling will eventually unfold. Moses probably thought those years were the rest of his life. A man can get used to almost anything if the years are long enough. He would have known the paths by then, known the flock, known the seasons. He would have watched his son grow. He would have woken before dawn and led sheep out while the sky was still pale and cool. He would have returned at evening with dust on his sandals and the ordinary weariness of honest work. And all the while, in Egypt, the children of Israel were still groaning. The king of Egypt died, but the suffering did not die with him. The people groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry rose up to God. God heard their groaning. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the children of Israel, and God knew. Those sentences are some of the most comforting sentences in the early story of Exodus. God heard. God remembered. God saw. God knew. Not because he had forgotten before and suddenly recovered the memory, the way we forget and remember. When Scripture says God remembered his covenant, it means the time had come for him to act on what he had promised. The prayers of slaves were not disappearing into the air. The cries from brick fields were not falling unheard into the dust. The God of their fathers had seen every lash, every grave, every child lost to Pharaoh's fear, every mother who had cried into the dark. And now, far away from Egypt, an old shepherd was leading a flock beyond the wilderness. Moses came to Horeb, the mountain of God. He was not looking for a miracle. That is important. He was doing his ordinary work, taking care of sheep, moving through a familiar world. The day may have seemed like any other day. The ground under his feet, the heat in the air, the small sounds of the flock, the long quiet of the wilderness. Then he saw a bush burning. Fire in the wilderness was not impossible. Dry places burn. Thorn bushes catch. A flame can rise quickly under the right conditions. But this fire was different. The bush burned, but it was not consumed. Moses stopped. He looked. The flame was real, but the branches did not vanish into ash. The fire held the bush without destroying it. It was the kind of sight that interrupts a life. The kind of thing that asks to be approached, not because it is safe, but because something in it is too strange to ignore. Moses said that he would turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush was not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him from the bush. "Moses, Moses," he said. "Here I am." The voice told him not to come near. He was to remove his sandals, because the place where he stood was holy ground. Holy ground. Not because the dust itself had always appeared different from other dust. Not because Horeb looked, to human eyes, like a place more sacred than the hills around it. It was holy because God was there. His presence made ordinary ground holy. The wilderness where Moses had walked with sheep became sanctuary. Then the voice said who was speaking. "The God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob." Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The God who spoke from the fire was not a new desert spirit, not a strange power attached to Midian. He was the God of the covenant, the God of the fathers, the God of the promises Moses had heard, perhaps from his mother, perhaps in the whispered memory of his people. The God whose people were still in Egypt. And God said that he had surely seen the affliction of his people. He had heard their cry. He knew their sufferings. He had come down to deliver them from Egypt and bring them into a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Then came the sentence that changed Moses' life. "Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." Moses had fled from Pharaoh. Now God was sending him back to Pharaoh. Moses had left Egypt as a man whose attempt to help had collapsed into fear and exile. Now God was calling him to return, not as an angry man acting alone, but as a servant sent by the God who had heard the cry of his people. Moses answered with the question that almost anyone might have asked. "Who am I? Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" It was not a foolish question. Moses knew Pharaoh's power. He knew Egypt from the inside. He knew the weight of the task. He knew his own history there. The last time he had tried to intervene, he had ended up running for his life. Now God was telling him to go back and confront not one Egyptian in secret, but the king of Egypt openly. Who am I? God did not answer by giving Moses a speech about Moses. He answered by giving Moses a promise about God. I will be with you. That was the answer. Not, Moses, you are stronger than you think. Not, Moses, you have hidden talents. Not, Moses, remember your palace education. Those things may have been true in their place, but they were not the foundation. The foundation was presence. I will be with you. That is enough in Scripture to carry impossible assignments. Moses asked what he should say when the Israelites asked the name of the God who had sent him. God answered with a name full of mystery and weight. I am who I am. Tell them I am has sent you. The God speaking from the bush was not dependent on Egypt, or on Moses, or on the wilderness, or on anything made. He is. Before Pharaoh ruled, he is. Before Israel groaned, he is. Before Moses was drawn from the water, he is. When empires rise and fall, he is. When the wilderness is silent, he is. When the people think they have been forgotten, he is. And this God was sending Moses. God told him to gather the elders of Israel and say that the Lord, the God of their fathers, had appeared to him. He told Moses that he had observed what had been done to them in Egypt, and that he would bring them up out of affliction into the land he had promised. The elders would listen. Then Moses and the elders were to go to the king of Egypt and ask to go into the wilderness to sacrifice to the Lord. But God also told Moses the hard part. Pharaoh would not let them go unless compelled by a mighty hand. God would stretch out his hand and strike Egypt with wonders. After that, Pharaoh would let them go. So Moses was told the outcome before the struggle began. Deliverance was certain, but it would not be immediate. Pharaoh's refusal was already known. The wonders were already in view. The road out of Egypt would pass through confrontation. Moses still hesitated. What if they do not believe me? What if they say the Lord did not appear to me? This, too, was not difficult to understand. Moses remembered the last words spoken to him by a Hebrew man in Egypt, who made you a prince and judge over us. He had been rejected before. He knew the pain of trying to help and being questioned by the very people he meant to defend. So God gave him signs. What is that in your hand? God asked. A staff, Moses said. Throw it on the ground. Moses threw it down, and it became a serpent. Moses ran from it. Then God told him to take it by the tail. Moses reached out, took hold of it, and it became a staff again in his hand. That staff would become one of the most recognizable objects in the story. A shepherd's staff. Ordinary wood from an ordinary life. The thing Moses carried while leading sheep would become the thing raised before Pharaoh, stretched over waters, lifted in moments when Israel needed to see that God was acting. God often begins with what is already in the hand. Then God gave another sign. Moses put his hand inside his cloak, and when he drew it out, it was diseased. He put it back, and when he drew it out again, it was restored. A third sign was given too. If they did not believe the first two, Moses could take water from the Nile and pour it on dry ground, and the water would become blood. The Nile again. The river where Hebrew sons had been sentenced to death would itself become a witness that God had seen. Still Moses hesitated. He said he was not eloquent. Not in the past. Not since God had spoken to him. He was slow of speech and slow of tongue. The man God was sending to speak to Pharaoh did not trust his own mouth. And the Lord answered him with a question. Who made man's mouth? Who makes him mute, or deaf, or seeing, or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, God said, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak. But Moses still did not go. He asked God to send someone else. There is honesty here, and there is also resistance. Moses was not merely nervous now. He was trying to refuse. The call had become too much. The fire was before him. The voice had spoken. The signs had been given. The promise had been made. And still the old shepherd from Midian stood on holy ground and wanted someone else to carry the burden. The Lord's anger burned against Moses. And yet even in that anger, God provided. Aaron, Moses' brother, was coming to meet him. Aaron could speak well. Moses would speak to Aaron, and Aaron would speak to the people. God would be with Moses' mouth and Aaron's mouth, and would teach them what to do. So Moses was not released from the calling. He was given help inside it. That is an important difference. Sometimes God does not remove the assignment that frightens a person. He gives them what they need to obey it. Moses wanted to be replaced. God gave him a brother. Moses wanted the burden handed to someone else. God gave him companionship on the road back. And Moses was to take the staff in his hand, the staff with which he would do the signs. The meeting at the bush ended, but Moses did not return to the same life. A man can walk away from holy ground, but he does not walk away unchanged. The sheep were still sheep. The wilderness was still the wilderness. Jethro's household was still there. But Moses had heard his name from the fire, and the sound of that does not leave a person. Moses went back to Jethro and asked permission to return to his brothers in Egypt to see whether they were still alive. Jethro told him to go in peace. Go in peace. It sounds simple, but the road ahead would not be simple. Moses was leaving the quiet life that had held him for 40 years. He was leaving the flocks, the known paths, the settled rhythms of Midian. He was taking his wife and sons and turning back toward the land where a death sentence had once hung over him. God told him that the men who had sought his life were dead. So Moses took his family, set them on a donkey, and returned to the land of Egypt. He carried the staff of God in his hand. The staff of God. It had been the staff of Moses, a shepherd's tool, a walking support, a piece of ordinary work. But now it was named by its new purpose, the staff of God. Not because the wood had changed, but because God had claimed it for his work. On the way, the story gives us a brief and difficult moment involving Moses' household and circumcision, a reminder that the covenant was not an abstract thing. Moses, the man sent to speak for the God of Abraham, had to be brought into obedience within his own family. Zipporah acted, and the journey continued. Some moments in Scripture are like that. Brief, strange to us, not softened or explained away. They stand there as reminders that the God who sends a servant also confronts the servant, that public calling does not cancel private obedience, and that Moses himself was not above the covenant he was going to announce. Meanwhile, God spoke to Aaron. Go into the wilderness to meet Moses. Aaron went and met him at the mountain of God. There is something deeply gentle about that meeting. Moses had asked not to go alone, and before he reached Egypt, his brother was already coming toward him through the wilderness. The brother he had not grown up beside in the ordinary way. The brother who had remained with the enslaved people while Moses had lived in the palace and then in exile. The brother who could speak where Moses felt weak. They met at the mountain of God, and Moses told Aaron all the words of the Lord and all the signs he had commanded him to do. Then the two brothers went to Egypt. Moses returned to the place he had fled. How strange it must have felt to see Egypt again. The river, the buildings, the roads, the faces of a people still carrying the same burden. Time had passed for Moses, but oppression had continued for Israel. The brick fields were still there. The taskmasters were still there. The ache of slavery had not become less real because Moses had spent years away from it. Moses and Aaron gathered the elders of the children of Israel. Aaron spoke all the words that the Lord had spoken to Moses. Moses performed the signs before the people, and the people believed. They believed. The thing Moses feared did not happen, at least not at first. The elders did not reject him. The people did not say the Lord had not appeared. When they heard that the Lord had visited the children of Israel and had seen their affliction, they bowed their heads and worshipped. That is a beautiful moment. Nothing outward had changed yet. Pharaoh had not relented. Bricks still had to be made. The store cities still stood as monuments to forced labor. The people were not free. They had not packed their belongings. They had not crossed the sea. They had only heard that God had seen, and they worshipped. Because sometimes the first mercy is not the removal of the burden, but the knowledge that the burden has been seen by God. Moses and Aaron then went to Pharaoh. Everything in the story had been moving toward that room. The basket in the reeds, the palace childhood, the flight to Midian, the years with the sheep, the burning bush, the signs, the meeting with Aaron, the gathered elders. All of it had brought Moses back into the presence of Egyptian power. But this time he did not stand alone. He stood as one sent. He and Aaron spoke the word of the Lord to Pharaoh. The God of Israel commanded that his people be allowed to go into the wilderness to hold a feast to him. Pharaoh answered with contempt, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice? I do not know the Lord. I will not let Israel go." That was the first answer from the throne of Egypt. Not fear, not curiosity, not negotiation, contempt. Pharaoh did not recognize the God who spoke through Moses. Egypt had its gods, its temples, its river, its king who imagined himself secure. The God of slaves did not impress him. Moses and Aaron pressed the request again, warning that the God of the Hebrews had met with them. But Pharaoh saw the request as laziness. He accused the people of wanting to escape their work. He ordered that the burden be made heavier. The people had been given straw to make bricks. Now they would have to gather straw for themselves, but the same number of bricks would still be required. Same quota, less provision, more suffering. This is what happened immediately after Moses obeyed God. Things got worse. That is one of the hardest truths in the beginning of the Exodus story. Obedience did not produce instant relief. The first confrontation with Pharaoh did not loosen the chains. It tightened them. The people who had bowed their heads and worshipped now found themselves scattered through the land, searching for stubble, trying to meet impossible demands with bodies already exhausted. The taskmasters beat the Israelite foreman. "Why have you not completed your required work?" they asked. The foreman went to Pharaoh and cried out that they were being treated unjustly. Pharaoh did not listen. He called them idle. He sent them back to the brick fields. When the Israelite foreman came out from Pharaoh, they met Moses and Aaron waiting for them, and their words were bitter. "May the Lord look on you and judge," they said, "because you have made us offensive to Pharaoh and his servants and have put a sword in their hand to kill us." The people who had believed were now angry. The man who had feared rejection was now standing in the rejection he had feared. Moses had gone to Pharaoh because God sent him. Aaron had spoken because God provided him. The signs had been shown. The elders had believed. Worship had risen. And yet now the burden was heavier than before. So Moses turned back to the Lord. This is what Moses would do again and again in the years to come. He would stand between God and the people, between the promise and the complaint, between the command and the impossibility of what stood in front of him. And when the weight became too much, he would turn back to God with the honesty of a man who did not know how to carry it. He asked why God had brought trouble on this people. He asked why God had sent him. Since he had come to Pharaoh to speak in God's name, Pharaoh had done evil to the people, and God had not delivered them. It is not polished prayer. It is not careful religious speech. It is Moses standing before God with the pain of the people in his ears and the failure of the first confrontation burning in his chest. He had obeyed, and the suffering had increased. He had spoken, and Pharaoh had hardened. He had returned to Egypt, and now the people blamed him for making their lives worse, and the Lord answered him, "Now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh." Not before the pain, not before the first refusal, not before Moses discovered that Pharaoh would not be impressed by words alone. Now, in the place where the burden had become unbearable, where Moses' confidence had been stripped away, where Israel's hope had been shaken almost as soon as it had awakened. Now you shall see. Under a strong hand, Pharaoh would let them go. Under a strong hand, he would drive them out of his land. The night was not over. The bricks still waited in the morning. The people were still bent beneath the weight. Pharaoh was still on the throne. But the God who had spoken from the bush was speaking again. And this time, the signs would not remain hidden in Moses' hand. They were about to fall on Egypt. And they did fall on Egypt. Not all at once. Not in one sudden blow that ended the matter before anyone had time to understand what was happening. God was going to unfold his power slowly, sign by sign, judgment by judgment, until the whole land knew what Pharaoh had refused to know. The God of the Hebrews was not a small tribal god, not a private comfort carried secretly by slaves in the corners of Goshen, not a memory from old fathers and old promises that the empire could safely ignore. He was the Lord, and Egypt was about to learn it. Moses and Aaron went again to Pharaoh. You can imagine the room. Stone columns, painted walls, servants moving carefully at the edges, guards standing with the practiced stillness of men trained not to react. Pharaoh seated in the center of it all, wrapped in the kind of power that teaches a man to believe his own refusal is stronger than reality. And in front of him stood two old Hebrew men. Moses was 80. Aaron was 83. They were not young revolutionaries. They were not warriors with swords hidden beneath their cloaks. They were not men who looked like the beginning of an empire's collapse. They were simply there, standing where God had sent them to stand, carrying a message that had not changed. The Lord had commanded Pharaoh to release his people. Pharaoh wanted a sign. Aaron cast down the staff, and it became a serpent before Pharaoh and his servants. For a moment, the court must have shifted. Not panic exactly. Pharaoh's court had seen spectacle before. Egypt was a land of ritual, symbol, magic, ceremony. The king himself wore the serpent on his crown as a sign of royal power. A serpent on the floor of the palace was not just a wonder. It was a challenge in the language Egypt understood. So Pharaoh called his wise men and magicians. They performed something that looked similar. Their staffs became serpents too. And for a moment, to the watching court, it may have seemed that the matter was balanced. Moses had power. Egypt had power. The Hebrews had signs. Pharaoh had signs. Perhaps this was not a confrontation between the Lord and Egypt, but merely a contest between one kind of sacred power and another. Then Aaron's staff swallowed theirs, quietly, completely. The sign was not loud, but it was clear. Whatever power Egypt could imitate, it could not overcome the power that had sent Moses there. But Pharaoh's heart remained hard. He would not listen. So the first judgment came to the Nile. The Nile was not just water. It was the life of Egypt. It fed the fields, filled the canals, carried boats, marked seasons, and made the land possible. Without the Nile, Egypt was desert. With it, Egypt was grain, cities, temples, storehouses, and empire. Every morning the river moved through the land like a promise that Egypt would continue. Moses met Pharaoh by the river. Aaron lifted the staff and struck the water, and the Nile turned to blood. The river that had carried the baskets of Hebrew children into death now carried death in itself. The fish died. The water stank. The canals and pools and vessels of water across the land were struck. The thing Egypt trusted most became undrinkable in its mouth. People dug along the riverbank, searching for clean water beneath the ground. The land that had seemed immovable was suddenly fragile. Pharaoh saw it. His magicians imitated enough of it to give him a reason not to bow. That is one of the strange things about a hardened heart. It does not need a good reason. It only needs something it can use as an excuse. It only needs a small patch of shadow where it can hide from the light that is already everywhere. Pharaoh turned and went into his house. 7 days passed. Then came the frogs. They came from the river in numbers no one could ignore. Into houses, into bedrooms, onto beds, into ovens, into kneading bowls. The land was alive with them, wet and restless and impossible to escape. What had sounded like a strange threat when Moses spoke it became a suffocating reality when every room of Egypt moved and croaked and stank with the creatures of the river. Again, Pharaoh's magicians produced frogs. But that did not help. Egypt did not need more frogs. The difference between imitation and deliverance began to show. Pharaoh's men could add to the trouble, but they could not remove it. They could make a sign, but they could not make Egypt clean again. So Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron. He asked them to plead with the Lord to take the frogs away, and he promised that if the frogs were removed, the people could go and sacrifice. Moses asked him to name the time. Tomorrow, Pharaoh said. Tomorrow. It is a strange answer and very human. Even when relief is offered, pride delays. Even when the room is full of frogs and the nation is groaning, a man who does not want to surrender still tries to keep one last piece of control. Moses prayed. The frogs died. They were gathered into heaps, and the land stank. And when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart again. This is the rhythm that began to settle over Egypt. Pressure. Promise. Relief. Refusal. Again and again. Not because Pharaoh did not understand. He understood enough to ask for prayer. He understood enough to promise obedience when the pain was heavy. But the moment the pain lifted, the promise evaporated. There are people who only want freedom from consequence, not freedom from pride. Pharaoh was one of them. The dust of the earth was struck next. And from the dust came gnats, or lice, tiny tormenting things that settled on people and animals alike. No palace wall could keep them out. No linen robe could protect the skin beneath it. No royal title could make a man immune to something small enough to rise from dust. This time the magicians could not imitate the sign. They looked at Pharaoh and said that this was the finger of God. But Pharaoh would not listen. Then came flies, heavy swarms, filling houses, darkening rooms, corrupting the land. But in Goshen, where Israel lived, the swarms did not come. For the first time, the distinction was made visible. Egypt was struck. Israel was spared. The people who had been treated as nothing were being marked out by the God who had heard their groaning. The empire that had counted them only as labor was forced to watch as their little region of the land became a boundary Pharaoh could not cross. Pharaoh called Moses. He tried to negotiate. "Sacrifice here in the land," he said. Moses refused. The people had to go as God commanded. Then Pharaoh offered a smaller permission. "Go, but do not go far. Do not go far." That is how bondage often speaks when it begins to lose control. It does not always say stay. Sometimes it says leave, but not fully. Worship, but not freely. Obey, but within the limits I approve. Go, but stay close enough that I can still reach you. Moses did not accept Pharaoh's terms. He prayed. The swarms departed. Not one remained. And Pharaoh hardened his heart again. Then the livestock of Egypt began to die. Horses, donkeys, camels, herds, flocks. The wealth of the land was struck in the field. Animals that represented movement, trade, food, and strength fell under a judgment that did not touch the livestock of Israel. Pharaoh sent men to check. He knew. He was not ignorant. He learned that the animals of Israel had been spared. Still, his heart did not yield. Then Moses took soot from a kiln. The image matters. A kiln was a place of forced labor. It was the place of brick making, the place where Israel's backs had bent and hands had hardened, the place where Pharaoh's buildings were formed from the suffering of the people he oppressed. Moses took dust from that furnace and threw it into the air. It became fine dust over Egypt. Boils broke out on people and animals. The magicians could not even stand before Moses because of the sores on their own bodies. The court that had once tried to match sign for sign was now humiliated in its own flesh. Still, Pharaoh would not listen. Then came the warning of hail. And this warning was different, because by now some Egyptians had begun to fear the word of the Lord. That is worth noticing. The judgments were falling on Egypt, but even in Egypt there were people learning to listen. Servants of Pharaoh heard the warning and hurried their livestock and slaves indoors. Others ignored it and left them in the field. Then the sky broke open. Hail fell with fire flashing through it, a storm unlike anything Egypt had known from the day it became a nation. It struck man and beast and every plant in the field. It shattered trees. It crushed the crops that were ready. The sound must have been enormous, a violence from above in a land that had grown used to trusting the regular kindness of the river below. Goshen was spared. Again, the boundary held. Pharaoh sent for Moses and Aaron. This time his words sounded stronger. He said that he had sinned. He said the Lord was righteous. He said he and his people were in the wrong. The words were true. But true words are not the same as a surrendered heart. Moses knew that Pharaoh and his servants still did not fear the Lord. He said so plainly, but he also stretched out his hands, and the thunder and hail ceased. When Pharaoh saw that the storm had stopped, he sinned again and hardened his heart. The wheat and spelt had not yet been destroyed. There was still something left to lose, so the locusts came. Before they came, Pharaoh's own servants tried to reason with him. They asked how long this man would be a snare to them. They told him Egypt was ruined. They could see what pride was costing the land, even if Pharaoh would not say it honestly. Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron back and asked who would go. Moses said everyone would go, young and old, sons and daughters. flocks and herds, the whole people, because the feast belonged to all of them. Pharaoh refused. He offered to let only the men go. Again, partial obedience. Again, control disguised as compromise. Moses would not accept it, so the east wind blew. All that day and all that night it blew, and in the morning it brought locusts over the land. They covered the surface of Egypt until the ground itself seemed to disappear beneath them. They ate what remained after the hail. Green things vanished. Trees were stripped. Fields became emptiness. The slow dismantling of Egypt continued. Water, homes, dust, air, animals, skin, sky, crops. Every layer of ordinary life was touched. Everything Egypt thought it could rely on was shown to be held not by Pharaoh, but by God. Pharaoh hurried to call Moses. He confessed again. He asked for forgiveness again. He asked Moses to plead for him again. Moses prayed. A strong west wind drove the locusts into the sea. Not one remained in all the territory of Egypt. And again Pharaoh's heart did not yield. Then came darkness. Not ordinary night, a darkness that could be felt. For 3 days, Egypt sat under it. People did not see one another. They did not rise from their places. The sun, which Egypt honored and trusted and associated with royal power, gave no help. The lamps of Egypt could not undo what had settled over the land. But the Israelites had light where they lived. That is a sentence to rest in for a moment. The land of Egypt was dark, but Israel had light. The people who had labored under Pharaoh's shadow were sitting in brightness, while the palace of Pharaoh was wrapped in darkness. The world had been reversed. The visible order of things had been turned inside out. Pharaoh sat in the dark, and slaves had light in their homes. After 3 days, Pharaoh called Moses. He allowed the people to go, but he said the flocks and herds must stay behind. Moses refused. Not a hoof would be left behind. They were not leaving as fugitives stealing a private moment of worship. They were leaving as the people of God, with everything God had commanded them to take, because their lives and their animals and their future and their worship belonged to the Lord. Pharaoh's anger burned. He told Moses to leave his presence and warned him never to see his face again. Moses said that Pharaoh had spoken correctly. He would not see his face again. But before Moses left, one final warning was given. One more plague would come. After that, Pharaoh would drive them out completely, not reluctantly, not with negotiation. He would urge them to leave. The firstborn in Egypt would die. From the firstborn of Pharaoh on the throne to the firstborn of the servant behind the mill, even the firstborn of the animals. A cry would rise in Egypt unlike any cry before it. But among Israel, there would be a distinction so complete that not even a dog would growl against them. Moses left Pharaoh in hot anger, and then the story narrowed. After signs across rivers and fields and sky, after judgments that moved over a whole nation, the focus came down to houses, doorways, families, a meal eaten at night. God gave Moses and Aaron instructions for Israel. Each household was to take a lamb. If a household was too small, it could join with a neighbor. The lamb was to be without blemish. It was to be kept until the appointed evening, and then it was to be killed at twilight. The blood was to be placed on the doorposts and lintel of the houses. Inside, the people would eat the lamb roasted with fire, along with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They would eat dressed for departure, sandals on their feet, staff in hand. They were to eat like people whose waiting was almost over. This was not an ordinary meal. It was a sign. It was shelter. It was memory before the event had even finished happening. The blood on the doorway marked the house as belonging to the Lord. Judgment would pass over where the blood was seen. The same night that brought death to Egypt would become deliverance for Israel. The people listened. This time they did not only bow their heads and worship, they acted. In house after house, lambs were taken. Fires were prepared. Bread was made without time for rising. Bitter herbs were gathered. Parents must have looked at children and tried to explain what even they could barely understand. By morning, we may be leaving. By morning, the world may be different. By morning, the promises told by our fathers may no longer be stories from the past, but the road beneath our feet. Night came. A quiet must have settled over Goshen, unlike any quiet they had known. Inside the houses, families ate quickly, not leisurely, not as people settling in, but as people poised between slavery and departure. The lamb, the bread, the bitter herbs, the staff in the hand, the sandals tied, the blood at the door. Outside, Egypt waited without understanding what it was waiting for. At midnight, the final plague came. Death moved through the land of Egypt. The firstborn died in the palace. The firstborn died in houses of servants. The firstborn died in prison. The firstborn of animals died in the fields and stalls. And a great cry rose through Egypt. There was not a house untouched by grief, except the houses marked by blood. This is a hard part of the story. It should feel hard. The Bible does not ask us to treat judgment as small. It does not ask us to rush past the sound of Egypt weeping. It tells us that Pharaoh had filled the Nile with the sons of Israel, that he had crushed a people beneath forced labor, that he had hardened himself through warning after warning, mercy after mercy, relief after relief. It tells us that God had been patient. It tells us that God had been clear. It tells us that Egypt was not struck in ignorance, but it still lets the cry of Egypt be a cry. And in the middle of that terrible night, Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron. "Leave," he said. "Go. Take your people. Take your flocks. Take your herds. Be gone, and bless me also." The man who had once asked who the Lord was now asked for blessing from the people he had refused to release. Egypt urged the Israelites to go quickly because they feared they would all die. So the people lifted the dough before it had risen. They wrapped kneading bowls in cloaks. They asked the Egyptians for silver and gold and clothing, and the Egyptians gave to them. The people who had been unpaid in their labor left with wealth from the land that had oppressed them. Then Israel went out. After generations in Egypt, they went out. Men, women, children, elders, flocks, herds, possessions, kneading bowls, staffs, memories, fear, wonder, grief, hope. A mixed multitude went with them too, people who had seen enough of Egypt's gods and enough of Israel's God to know where they wanted to stand when the dust settled. The number was enormous, a nation walking out of slavery in the night. The Lord had kept watch. That is how the story holds it. The night of their leaving was not only a night when Israel stayed awake, it was a night when the Lord kept watch over them. All those years when they had wondered if the promise had been forgotten, all those years when the bricks were heavy and the sons were threatened and the groaning rose from exhausted bodies, God had not been absent. He had been watching, and now his people were walking. Before they went far, God gave them memory to carry with them. That may sound strange, because the event was still happening. Their sandals were still dusty from Egypt's roads. Their bread was still unleavened because there had been no time. Their children were still asking questions with frightened faces. And yet God was already teaching them how to remember. This night was to be kept. Year after year, they would tell it again. They would eat the meal again. They would explain the bread without leaven and the lamb and the blood and the haste of departure. Fathers and mothers would say to their children that this was done because of what the Lord did when he brought them out of Egypt. The story was not to remain only in the minds of those who saw it. It was to enter the calendar, the table, the questions of children, the habits of a people. Because human beings forget deliverance with astonishing speed. We remember fear more easily than mercy. We remember hunger more quickly than rescue. We can stand on the far side of a miracle and, within days, start speaking as if God has abandoned us. So God gave Israel a way to remember before forgetfulness had time to grow. He also claimed the firstborn. The night of Passover had drawn a line through Egypt and through Israel, through death and shelter, through judgment and mercy. The firstborn of Israel had lived not because Israel was stronger, wiser, or more deserving, but because God provided a covering and told them to trust it. From that point on, the firstborn belonged to him in a special way. Their life was a gift received back from the edge of judgment. Even this was mercy shaped into memory. Every firstborn son would remind the family that the Lord had spared. Every redeemed life would point backward to the night when death passed over the blood-marked doors. Israel's future would carry signs of Israel's rescue, and Moses carried something else. he took the bones of Joseph with him. Joseph had died generations earlier, after bringing his family into Egypt in the days of famine. Before his death, he had made the children of Israel promise that when God visited them and brought them up from Egypt, they would carry his bones with them. Joseph had believed in the promise when Egypt still felt like safety. He had seen, by faith, that Egypt was not the final home. So Moses took Joseph's bones. A nation of the living walked out with the bones of a man who had trusted God centuries before. The promise had outlived pharaohs. It had outlived taskmasters. It had outlived buildings and dynasties and the long silence of years. Joseph had waited in a coffin. Now even he was leaving Egypt, not by the shortest road. That matters too. There was a direct way toward the land of Canaan, but it passed near the territory of the Philistines. God did not lead them that way, because the people were not ready for war. They had been slaves the day before. Their hands knew brick molds better than battle lines. Their ears knew the commands of taskmasters better than the commands of captains. A straight road is not always a merciful road, so God led them by the wilderness way, toward the sea. He went before them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Cloud for the heat, fire for the dark, guidance that could be seen, presence that did not leave. Imagine the first night away from Egypt. No taskmaster counting bricks, no Egyptian shouting orders at dawn, no city wall pressing close around them. Only the open road, the sound of animals, the murmur of families, the strange weight of freedom settling slowly onto people who had not yet learned how to carry it. They were free, and they were terrified. Both can be true at the same time. Freedom is not always calm at first. Sometimes freedom feels like exposure, like the loss of the walls that harmed you but also told you where to stand. Israel had left Egypt, but Egypt had shaped their expectations. They would need more than an exit. They would need to be remade. God was going to do that. But first, Pharaoh changed his mind. The familiar pattern returned one last time. Relief, regret, pursuit. When Pharaoh heard that the people had fled, he and his servants asked what they had done. They had released their labor force. They had let Israel go from serving them. Pride and economics and grief twisted together, and Pharaoh prepared his chariots. 600 chosen chariots, and other chariots with them. The army of Egypt rolled out after the people who had just walked away. Israel was camped by the sea. In front of them was water. Behind them came Pharaoh. When the people lifted their eyes and saw the Egyptians marching after them, fear broke over them like a wave. They cried out to the Lord. Then they turned on Moses. "Were there no graves in Egypt?" they asked, "that you brought us out here to die?" It is bitter, but it is also understandable. They were not soldiers yet. They were families trapped between a sea and an army. The sound of chariot wheels would have awakened every old fear in their bodies. Egypt was coming back. The hand they had escaped was reaching for them again. Moses stood before a terrified people and a closing army, and he told them not to fear. "Stand firm," he said in his own words, "and see the deliverance the Lord will accomplish." The Egyptians they saw that day, they would not see in the same way again. The Lord would fight for them. They needed only to be still. Then God told Moses to move forward. That too matters. There is a time to stand and see, and there is a time to lift the staff and walk. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The pillar of cloud moved behind Israel, standing between them and Egypt. Darkness lay on one side, light on the other. All night, a strong east wind drove the sea back. The waters divided. The seabed became dry ground, and Israel walked through the sea. Try to imagine it slowly, not as a painted scene on a wall, as footsteps, a mother holding a child's hand, an old man leaning on a staff, animals being urged forward, people looking left and right at walls of water where water should not stand, the wind moving hard through the night, the ground firm beneath their feet, the cloud behind them, the fire giving light, the impossible road opening only because God held it open. They crossed. The Egyptians followed. In the morning watch, confusion struck the Egyptian camp. Chariot wheels clogged and swerved. The army that had moved in confidence began to panic. They understood too late that the Lord was fighting for Israel. Moses stretched out his hand again. The sea returned. The waters covered the chariots, the horsemen, the army of Pharaoh that had gone after them into the sea. Israel stood on the far shore and saw Egypt dead on the seashore. The threat that had shaped their lives lay broken behind them, and the people feared the Lord. They believed in him and in Moses, his servant. Then they sang. Moses and the people sang to the Lord because the horse and rider had been thrown into the sea. Miriam, the prophetess, the sister who had once watched a basket among the reeds, took a tambourine in her hand. The women followed her with tambourines and dancing. Miriam had seen the beginning. She had stood by the Nile as a child while her baby brother floated in a basket under the shadow of Pharaoh's command. Now she stood by another water, older, with the sea behind her and Egypt broken in it, leading the women in praise. The same God had been present at both waters, at the Nile, hidden and quiet, at the sea, visible and overwhelming. But the same God, always. Israel moved into the wilderness of Shur. 3 days they traveled without finding water. This is how quickly the story changes. One chapter is song, the next is thirst. That does not mean the song was false. It means the wilderness was real. They came to a place with water, but the water was bitter. The place was called Mara, bitterness. The people grumbled against Moses, asking what they were supposed to drink. Moses cried to the Lord. God showed him a piece of wood. Moses threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. The Lord was teaching them already. The God who could split the sea could also sweeten a spring. The God of the great deliverance was also God of the daily need. Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped there by the water. It was not the promised land, not yet, but it was rest, a small kindness in the wilderness, shade, water, a place to breathe. Then the road continued. In the wilderness, hunger came. The people grumbled again. They remembered Egypt strangely. Memory can do that when fear is present. It can polish the past until slavery begins to look like security. They spoke of pots of meat and bread to the full, forgetting the whips, the brick quotas, the river, the cries. They accused Moses and Aaron of bringing them out to kill them with hunger. The Lord answered with bread from heaven. In the evening, quail came over the camp. In the morning, dew lay around them, and when the dew lifted, there was a fine, flaky substance on the ground. The people looked at it and asked what it was. Manna. What is it? That question became its name. Moses told them it was the bread the Lord had given them to eat. Each person was to gather enough for the day. Not too much, not too little. Enough. This was not only food, it was training. Every morning, Israel had to learn trust with their hands. They had to wake up and gather what God had given for that day. They could not store up anxiety against tomorrow, except before the Sabbath as God commanded. When some tried to keep extra on ordinary days, it spoiled. When they gathered for the Sabbath, as instructed, it kept. The lesson was simple and difficult. Daily bread, daily dependence, daily mercy. The wilderness was not just the place between Egypt and Canaan. It was the place where slaves were being taught how to live as sons and daughters of the covenant. They moved again. At Rephidim, there was no water. The people quarreled with Moses. Their fear sharpened into accusation. Why had he brought them out of Egypt? Was it to kill them, their children, and their livestock with thirst? Moses cried to the Lord again. What shall I do with this people? He asked. They are almost ready to stone me. God told him to take the staff, the same staff with which he had struck the Nile, and go to the rock at Horeb. Moses struck the rock, and water came out for the people to drink. The staff that had turned Egypt's river to blood now brought water from stone. Judgment for Egypt, provision for Israel. The same power, directed by the same God, answering different needs in different ways. Then Amalek came and fought with Israel. This was their first battle. Moses told Joshua to choose men and go fight. Joshua appears here almost quietly, without a long introduction, but his life would become bound to Moses from this point forward. He would learn in the shadow of the prophet. He would watch the meetings, the failures, the intercessions, the glory on the mountain, the grief of the wilderness. He would become the man who one day led the people where Moses could not go. But on this day, he was simply Joshua, going out to fight Amalek. Moses went up the hill with the staff of God in his hand. Aaron and Hur went with him. When Moses held up his hands, Israel prevailed. When his hands lowered, Amalek prevailed. And Moses grew tired. That detail is tender in its honesty. Moses was the man who had stood before Pharaoh, the man who had lifted the staff over the sea, the man through whom God had brought plagues and water and signs. And still his arms got tired. So Aaron and Hur brought a stone, and Moses sat on it. They stood on either side of him and held up his hands until sunset. Joshua overwhelmed Amalek. But the picture on the hill is the picture to remember. A leader seated in weakness, friends holding up his hands, the battle below depending on a dependence above. Moses would carry burdens that no man could carry alone. God did not make him pretend otherwise. Even here, near the beginning, Moses needed others beside him. Then Jethro came. Moses' father-in-law heard what God had done for Israel and brought Zipporah and Moses' sons to him in the wilderness. There was reunion there, family in the camp, old Midianite ties meeting the new life Moses had been given. Moses told Jethro everything the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to Egypt, and all the hardship that had met them on the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. Jethro rejoiced. He blessed the Lord. He confessed that the Lord was greater than all gods. Then he watched Moses work. From morning until evening, the people stood around Moses while he judged their disputes and made known God's statutes and instructions. It was too much. Everyone could see it except, perhaps, Moses. Jethro told him plainly that what he was doing was not good, not because the work did not matter, because the burden would crush him and the people would be worn out waiting. He told Moses to appoint capable men, trustworthy men, men who feared God and hated dishonest gain. Let them judge the smaller matters. Let the harder matters come to Moses. Moses listened. That is another quiet mark of him. He was not too proud to receive wisdom from an old shepherd priest from Midian. He had been corrected before by God. Now he was advised by family. He accepted the help. Leadership in the wilderness would require humility as much as courage. Then they came to Sinai, the mountain of God, the place where Moses had once stood alone before the burning bush, barefoot in the quiet, hearing his name spoken from fire. Now he returned with a nation. That is one of the beautiful circles in the story. God had told him at the bush that when he brought the people out of Egypt, they would worship on this mountain. At the time, Moses had no army, no confidence, no plan, and no reason to believe Pharaoh would yield. The promise must have seemed enormous, almost impossible to hold in the mind. But now the mountain was in front of him, and Israel was there. The promise had become geography. The Lord called to Moses from the mountain. He told him to speak to the house of Jacob and the people of Israel. They had seen what God did to Egypt. They had seen how he carried them, as if on eagle's wings, and brought them to himself. Now, if they would listen to his voice and keep his covenant, they would be his treasured possession among all peoples. The whole earth was his, but they would be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Moses came down and set the words before the elders. The people answered together that they would do all the Lord had spoken. Moses brought their words back to God. Then came preparation. The people were to consecrate themselves. They were to wash their garments. They were to set boundaries around the mountain. No one was to force closeness with God on their own terms. The mountain would be holy because God would descend upon it. For 2 days, the camp prepared. Clothes washed, boundaries marked, voices lowered, children warned, animals kept back, the mountain standing over them in silence as if holding its breath. On the 3rd day, thunder came. Lightning flashed. A thick cloud covered the mountain. A trumpet sound grew louder and louder until the whole camp trembled. Moses brought the people out to meet God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. Smoke rose like the smoke of a kiln. and the whole mountain shook violently. The God who had taken Moses from a quiet flame in a bush now descended before a nation in fire and thunder. And God spoke. He reminded them who he was first. Not first to rule, first to rescue. He was the Lord, their God, the one who brought them out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Only then came the commands. They were to have no other gods before him. They were not to make idols. They were not to misuse his name. They were to keep the Sabbath holy. They were to honor father and mother. They were not to murder, not to commit adultery, not to steal, not to bear false witness, not to covet what belonged to their neighbor. The 10 words came not as a ladder by which slaves could climb into God's favor, but as the shape of life after deliverance. God had already brought them out. Now he was teaching them what freedom was for. The people trembled. They drew back. They asked Moses to speak with them instead, because the nearness of God's voice was too much for them. Moses told them not to fear in the wrong way. God had come so that a holy fear would be before them, keeping them from sin. Then Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. That phrase is worth sitting with. The thick darkness where God was. Not where God was absent, where God was. There are kinds of darkness in the story that mean judgment, like the darkness over Egypt. But there is also this darkness, the clouded hiddenness of a God too holy and too great to be handled casually. Moses walked toward that darkness because the voice within it had called him. The covenant continued. Laws were given about worship, justice, servants, violence, property, honesty, mercy, feasts, and rest. These laws may sound ordinary when read quickly, but they were the architecture of a people being rebuilt from slavery. Israel had lived under the law of Pharaoh, where the strong consumed the weak and the vulnerable existed at the convenience of the powerful. Now they were given a different order. The stranger mattered, the poor mattered, the servant mattered, the injured mattered, truth mattered, rest mattered, worship mattered. Even the land would eventually matter, because the God who gave Sabbath to people would also teach them that creation itself belonged to him. Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules. Again, they answered that they would do all the Lord had spoken. Moses wrote the words down. Early in the morning, he built an altar at the foot of the mountain and set up 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel. Offerings were made. Blood was taken. Half was thrown against the altar. Half was placed in basins. Then Moses read the book of the covenant in the hearing of the people. They said again that they would obey. Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people as the blood of the covenant the Lord had made with them. Blood at the doorway had marked their deliverance from Egypt. Blood at the mountain now marked their covenant with God. They had been saved from slavery. Now they were bound to the Savior. Then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. The text does not explain this in a way that removes the mystery. It simply says what happened, and then gives us an image beneath his feet, something like pavement of sapphire, clear as the heavens. They beheld God, and they ate and drank. That is one of the quiet wonders of the whole story. A meal on the mountain. Elders who had once belonged to a slave people now sitting in covenant peace before the God who had delivered them. Not crushed, not consumed. Welcomed into a fellowship they could never have created for themselves. Egypt was behind them. The sea was behind them. The mountain was beneath them. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had brought them to himself. Then the Lord called Moses higher. "Come up to me on the mountain," God said, "and remain there." He would give Moses tablets of stone, the instruction and commandment written for the teaching of the people. Moses rose with Joshua, his assistant. Before he went, he told the elders to wait. Aaron and Hur would be with them. If any matter arose, they could go to them. Then Moses went up the mountain. The cloud covered it. The glory of the Lord settled on Sinai. For 6 days, the cloud covered the mountain. On the 7th day, God called to Moses from within the cloud. To the eyes of Israel below, the glory of the Lord looked like a consuming fire on the top of the mountain. Moses entered the cloud, and he went up. 40 days and 40 nights. Below him, the people waited at the foot of Sinai, looking up at fire and cloud, with the covenant words still fresh in their ears, the promise of obedience still warm on their lips. Above them, Moses disappeared into the presence of God, and in that waiting space, while the mountain burned and the camp watched, and the days began to lengthen, the next great test of Israel's heart, the days began to pass. One day, then another. Moses did not come down. From below, the mountain still looked alive with fire. Cloud wrapped the upper slopes the way night wraps a distant hill, and the people kept looking up, waiting for movement, waiting for a figure to appear against the brightness. The covenant words were still fresh in their ears. The promise of obedience was still warm on their lips. They had heard the voice of God, trembled at the thunder, and watched Moses climb into the cloud until the smoke and glory swallowed him from sight. At first, the waiting may have felt holy. Then it began to feel long. Morning came, and Moses was not there. Evening came, and Moses was not there. The manna still appeared. The camp still woke. Fires were lit, children were fed, animals were gathered, and the ordinary work of the wilderness continued beneath a mountain that looked anything but ordinary. But waiting has a way of revealing what signs alone cannot settle. Israel had seen wonders. They had seen Egypt broken and the sea open and bread arrive from heaven. But now, beneath Sinai, with no visible leader in the camp and no visible shape for the God who had delivered them, the question moved quietly from tent to tent. Could they trust the unseen God while Moses remained hidden? Could they wait without reaching for something they could control? That was the test. Not the thunder, not the lightning, the waiting. For 40 days, the mountain burned. To the eyes of the people, the top of Sinai looked like fire. Cloud wrapped the upper slopes. Thunder had already shaken them. The voice of God had already spoken commandments into the open air until the people trembled and begged not to hear the voice directly anymore. They had promised obedience. They had heard the words of the covenant. They had stood at the foot of the mountain and said, in one voice, that all the Lord had spoken, they would do. Then Moses went up, and Moses did not come back quickly. That was the test. Not the thunder, not the lightning, not the nearness of the mountain. Waiting was the test. Because fear does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, one day at a time, as an unanswered question. Where is Moses? Why is he taking so long? What has happened to him in the cloud? Has the man who brought us out of Egypt disappeared? Are we alone here, at the edge of a wilderness, without a visible leader and without a visible God to go before us? The days lengthened. The camp grew restless. And restlessness, when it is not brought honestly before God, begins looking for something it can touch. The people gathered around Aaron. Aaron had seen everything Moses had seen. He had stood with Moses before Pharaoh. He had lifted the staff. He had watched the Nile turn. He had heard the cries of Egypt in the night of Passover. He had walked through the sea on dry ground. He had eaten manna. He had heard the voice from Sinai. And yet in that moment, surrounded by a frightened crowd, Aaron gave way. The people said they wanted gods who would go before them. They wanted something visible, something shaped by hands, something that could be carried and pointed to and named without the terror of fire on a mountain. Aaron told them to bring gold. Earrings came from ears, ornaments from households. Pieces of Egypt, carried out on the night of deliverance, now gathered into a pile for a terrible purpose. The gold that had come with them out of slavery was melted and shaped into the image of a calf. Then the people looked at the thing they had made and spoke as though it had done what only God had done. They said it had brought them up out of Egypt. Think about that gently, because it is one of the strangest and saddest moments in the whole story. The sea was still behind them. The manna was still arriving. The mountain was still burning. And at the foot of that mountain, with the signs of God all around them, they gave the credit for their rescue to something that had not existed the day before. That is what fear can do. It can stand surrounded by evidence and still reach for an idol. The scene had not changed, only their trust had shifted. Aaron built an altar before it. A feast was announced. The people rose early. They offered sacrifices. They ate and drank. Then the celebration became wild and disorderly. The camp that had promised obedience became a camp of noise and confusion beneath the mountain of God. Above them, in the cloud, God spoke to Moses. "Go down," the Lord said. The people had corrupted themselves. God told Moses what they had done. He spoke of judgment. He said that their stubbornness was plain. He offered Moses something that would have sounded, to a different kind of man, like an opportunity. The people could be consumed, and from Moses, God could begin again. Moses could become the beginning of a new nation. But Moses did not seize the offer. He interceded. This is one of the defining moments of Moses' life. He had been reluctant to lead. He had argued at the bush. He had felt weak in speech and inadequate for the task. He had been wounded by Israel's accusations and exhausted by Pharaoh's refusals. But when the people stood under judgment, Moses stood between them and what they deserved. He appealed to the name of God, to the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to the nations who would misunderstand Israel's destruction if the people were brought out of Egypt only to perish in the wilderness. He did not pretend the people were innocent. He did not excuse what they had done. He pleaded from the covenant, from the promise, from the character of the God who had brought them out. And the Lord relented from the disaster spoken against the people. Then Moses turned and came down the mountain. He carried the tablets in his hands, stone tablets written with the finger of God. Joshua, who had been waiting part way up the mountain, heard the sound from the camp and thought it might be the noise of battle. Moses knew it was not battle. He came down far enough to see the calf, the dancing, the gold in the shape of a creature, the people God had delivered bowing before the work of their own hands. And Moses' anger burned. He threw the tablets from his hands and broke them at the foot of the mountain. The breaking of the tablets was not random rage. It was visible truth. The covenant had been broken before Moses ever reached the camp. What shattered in the stone was what had already shattered in the hearts of the people. He took the calf. He destroyed it. He ground it down until the object of their worship became dust. The thing they had called a god could not defend itself, could not speak, could not resist the hands that unmade it. Then Moses turned to Aaron. "What did this people do to you?" Moses asked, "that you brought such a great sin upon them?" Aaron's answer was weak in the way human answers often are when guilt is trying to step sideways away from itself. He blamed the people. He spoke as though the gold had simply emerged as a calf on its own, as though the idol had happened to him rather than through him. Moses saw the people running loose. He stood at the gate of the camp and called for those who were on the Lord's side to come to him. The sons of Levi gathered to him. Judgment moved through the camp that day. It was severe, and it was terrible, because the covenant people had brought idolatry into the shadow of Sinai almost as soon as the covenant had been made. The next day, Moses spoke to the people. "You have sinned a great sin," he told them. Then he went back up to the Lord. This time his intercession became even deeper. He asked God to forgive the people. "And if not," he said, "then blot me out of the book you have written." This is Moses at the fullest stretch of love and burden. He is not a distant leader now, not a man merely carrying instructions. He is a shepherd willing to be counted with the sheep, a mediator willing to stand under the weight of the people he leads. God answered with justice and mercy together. The guilty would not be treated as innocent, yet the people would continue. An angel would go before them. The journey was not over, but something had changed. God told Moses that he would not go up among the people in the same way, lest their stubbornness bring destruction upon them. The people heard this, and they mourned. They removed their ornaments. The camp became quieter. Moses took the tent and pitched it outside the camp. It was called the Tent of Meeting. Anyone who sought the Lord went out to that place. When Moses entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance, and the Lord would speak with Moses. The people would rise and watch from the entrances of their own tents. They had made a golden image because they wanted something visible. Now they watched the cloud. And Moses spoke with God as a man speaks with his friend. There is a tenderness in that sentence that is worth resting in. Moses, the child hidden in the Nile reeds. Moses, the prince who became an exile. Moses, the shepherd who said he could not speak. Moses, the man who trembled before Pharaoh and stood before a sea and climbed into fire. He had become the friend of God. The phrase is quiet, but it carries a mountain inside it. Not because he had become easy, not because the road had become simple, but because the long obedience of his life had become relationship. He went into the tent, and the cloud descended, and the presence of God met him there. Moses asked for the one thing he knew the people could not survive without. He asked God to go with them. "If your presence does not go with us," he said in essence, "do not send us from here." That was the heart of the whole story. Not Egypt defeated, not bread from heaven, not water from stone, not a land flowing with milk and honey. Presence. The people could not be the people of God if God himself did not go with them. And God answered Moses. His presence would go. He would give rest. Then Moses asked for something more. "Show me your glory." It is one of the boldest requests ever spoken by a human being. He had seen signs. He had seen the sea divide. He had seen fire in a bush and fire on a mountain. He had watched the cloud descend and rise. But Moses wanted to know God more deeply still. Not simply what God could do, who God was. God told Moses that no man could see his face and live. But God would place Moses in a cleft of the rock. He would cover him as he passed by. Moses would see the afterglow, the passing brightness, the trace of glory too great to be faced directly. So Moses cut 2 new tablets of stone and rose early in the morning. He climbed Sinai again, alone, with the stone in his hands. The Lord descended in the cloud and proclaimed his own name. Merciful, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, yet not clearing the guilty as though justice did not matter. Mercy and justice held together in the name of God. Moses bowed quickly to the ground. He worshipped, and he asked again that the Lord would go among them, though they were a stiff-necked people. He asked that God would pardon their sin and take them as his inheritance. The covenant was renewed. Moses remained with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights. Again, he neither ate bread nor drank water. Again, the commandments were given. Again, the people waited below. But this time, when Moses came down, his face shone. He did not know it at first. Aaron and the people saw him and were afraid to come near. The skin of his face was radiant because he had been speaking with God. Something of the light of the meeting clung to him. The man who had once hidden his face at a burning bush now came down from the mountain with brightness on his own face. Moses called them near. He spoke the words of the Lord. And when he had finished speaking, he covered his face with a veil. When he went in before the Lord, he removed it. When he came back out to speak to Israel, the people saw the radiance again. This rhythm marked him. Into the presence, out to the people, face uncovered before God, face veiled before Israel. The friend of God carrying light back into a camp that had nearly lost everything. Then came the building of the tabernacle. God had given Moses detailed instructions on the mountain. Not because God needed a house as men need houses, but because he was giving Israel a way to live with his presence in the middle of them. A sanctuary, a tent, a holy place built for a traveling people, so that the presence of God would not remain only on Sinai, but would journey with them through the wilderness. The people brought materials: gold, silver, bronze, blue and purple and scarlet yarn, fine linen, goat's hair, ram skins, acacia wood, oil, spices, precious stones. This time the gold was not shaped into an idol. This time what they carried out of Egypt was given back for the worship of the God who had brought them out. Skilled hands began to work. Bezalel and Oholiab led the craftsmen. Wood was cut and overlaid. Curtains were woven. Rings and poles and frames were fashioned. The ark was made. The table, the lampstand, the altar of incense, the bronze altar, the basin, the priestly garments. Every piece had its place. Every detail mattered. It was slow work. Holy work often is. It is measured in faithfulness more than speed. Not dramatic, not loud. Measurements and fabric and hammered metal and carefully prepared oil. Day after day, the camp that had once gathered around a golden calf now gathered its skill around the dwelling place of the Lord. Moses inspected the work. Everything had been done as the Lord commanded. Then the tabernacle was raised. The frames stood. The curtains were spread. The ark was placed inside. The veil was hung. The holy things were arranged. The altar was set. The basin was filled. The courtyard was completed. And when Moses finished the work, the cloud covered the tent of meeting. The glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter because the cloud settled upon it and the glory filled it. The presence that had burned on the mountain had come down into the middle of the camp. From then on, when the cloud lifted, Israel set out. When the cloud remained, Israel stayed. By day the cloud was over the tabernacle. By night there was fire in it, in the sight of all the house of Israel, throughout all their journeys. God was with them. That was the miracle at the center of everything. The people who had made an idol had not been abandoned. The people who had doubted had not been cast away. The people who had broken covenant had been given a tabernacle. And Moses, who had pleaded for presence, watched the presence of God settle among them. For a time, the camp learned the rhythms of holiness. Priests were consecrated. Sacrifices were offered. Laws were given for clean and unclean, for justice, for worship, for mercy, for the daily life of a people learning how to belong to a holy God. Aaron and his sons were set apart for the priesthood. Moses washed them, clothed them, anointed them, and placed the offerings in their hands. There were solemn days. There were careful instructions. There were fires that burned as signs of acceptance and warnings that holiness could not be treated casually. When Aaron's sons Nadab and Abihu offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, they died before him. It was a painful moment in Aaron's house and in Moses' leadership. The same presence that gave life was not something to be handled carelessly. The holy God who had come to dwell with his people was not an ornament in their camp. He was the Lord. The wilderness would teach Israel that again and again. After nearly a year at Sinai, the cloud lifted. The people set out, tribe by tribe, standard by standard. The tabernacle carried in the middle, the ark going before them. Moses had married into Midian years before, and now he asked Hobab, his relative by marriage, to come with them and be eyes for them in the wilderness. Moses knew the cloud led them, but he also knew the value of human wisdom on difficult ground. Faith did not make practical help unnecessary. The camp moved, and almost immediately, complaining returned. There was a pattern to it, and Moses would come to know the pattern too well. The people would travel. Hardship would press. Memory would soften Egypt and sharpen the wilderness. The past would be edited until slavery seemed almost comfortable and freedom seemed like a mistake. Then the murmuring would begin. They complained about hardship. Fire burned at the outskirts of the camp until Moses prayed. They complained about the manna. The bread from heaven, which had saved their lives morning after morning, began to feel ordinary to them. They remembered fish and cucumbers and melons and leeks and onions and garlic from Egypt. They spoke as though Egypt had been a table and not a house of bondage. They forgot the bricks. They forgot the lash. They forgot the command against their sons. Moses heard them weeping by their tents, and he broke under the weight of it. He spoke honestly to God. Why have you dealt this way with me? Did I conceive all this people? Am I their mother, that I should carry them in my arms to the land you swore to give their fathers? Where can I get meat for all these people? The burden is too heavy for me. If this is how it will be, take my life rather than let me see my wretchedness. This is not polished prayer. This is exhausted prayer. And God did not shame Moses for telling the truth. He told Moses to gather 70 elders. God would put some of the spirit that was on Moses upon them, and they would bear the burden with him. Moses had learned before, through Jethro, that leadership was not meant to be carried alone. Now God himself gave him helpers for the spiritual weight of the people. The Spirit rested on the elders, and they prophesied. When 2 men, Eldad and Medad, prophesied in the camp rather than at the tent, Joshua wanted Moses to stop them. But Moses answered with a generosity that reveals the largeness of his heart. He wished that all the Lord's people were prophets and that the Lord would put his spirit on them. Moses was not jealous for his own uniqueness. He was tired, yes. Burdened, yes. But not possessive of God's presence. Then quail came in abundance, and with it judgment on the craving that had despised the gift already given. The place received a name connected with graves, because desire without gratitude had led the people into sorrow again. And still the road continued. Moses' own family then became a place of testing. Miriam and Aaron spoke against him. The surface issue concerned Moses' Cushite wife, but the deeper issue was authority. Had the Lord spoken only through Moses? Had he not spoken through them also? The Lord heard. That is the sentence that matters. Moses did not need to defend himself in that moment. The text pauses to say that Moses was very meek, more than anyone on the face of the earth. Then the Lord called Moses, Aaron, and Miriam to the tent of meeting. He spoke plainly. Prophets might receive dreams and visions. But with Moses, God spoke mouth to mouth, clearly and not in riddles. Moses beheld the form of the Lord. Why, then, were they not afraid to speak against him? When the cloud lifted, Miriam was leprous, white as snow. Aaron pleaded with Moses, and Moses cried out to God for her healing. Again, Moses interceded, even when wronged, even when the challenge came from his own sister and brother. He did not use her punishment as proof of his importance. He prayed for mercy. Miriam was shut outside the camp for 7 days, and the people did not move until she was brought in again. Then Israel came near the land. This is the part of the story that should have been the threshold. The wilderness had not been meant to last 40 years. The people came to the wilderness of Paran, and from there men were sent to spy out Canaan. 1 man from each tribe. Among them were Caleb from Judah and Joshua from Ephraim. They went up into the land. They passed through the hill country. They saw the cities, the fields, the people, the fruit. They cut down a cluster of grapes so large it had to be carried on a pole between 2 men. They returned after 40 days with evidence in their hands that the land was good. It truly flowed with abundance. But the cities were strong. The people were large. The sons of Anak were there. The report divided at the place where faith and fear always divide. Caleb quieted the people and said they should go up at once. They were well able to take it. The other spies said they were not able. They described the land in terms of fear. They made themselves small in their own eyes, and then assumed they were small in everyone else's eyes too. Fear became interpretation. The same land that produced abundance became a land that devoured its inhabitants. The same promise that should have strengthened them became impossible because of the size of the people already there. That night the congregation lifted up their voices and cried. They wept. They said they should have died in Egypt or in the wilderness. They accused God of bringing them there to fall by the sword. They spoke of choosing a leader and returning to Egypt. At the border of promise, they turned their hearts back towards slavery. Moses and Aaron fell on their faces. Joshua and Caleb tore their clothes. They pleaded with the people not to rebel, not to fear, not to believe that the inhabitants of the land were stronger than the God who had brought them this far. But the congregation spoke of stoning them. Then the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting. Again, judgment was deserved. Again, Moses interceded. He appealed to the nations who had heard of God's fame. He appealed to the name God had proclaimed to him on the mountain, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression. He asked God to pardon the people according to the greatness of his love. The Lord pardoned. But pardon did not remove consequence. The generation that had seen the glory and signs and still refused to trust would not enter the land. Their children, whom they had said would become prey, would enter. The wilderness would become the place where the unbelieving generation passed away. 40 years, corresponding to the 40 days of spying. The men who brought the bad report died by plague. Joshua and Caleb lived. The people mourned when they heard it. But even their mourning became disobedient. They tried to go up and fight after God had told them not to go. Moses warned them that the Lord would not be with them in that attempt. They went anyway, presumptuously, and were struck down. There is a grief that repents, and there is a grief that merely hates consequence. Israel had not yet learned the difference, so the long wandering began. Years passed in the wilderness. The story moves differently here. Not every day is described. Whole seasons are folded into a few words. Camps were made and broken. Children grew taller. Graves were dug. The pillar moved, and the people moved. The pillar stayed, and the people stayed. Sand and stone and heat and cold became the ordinary world. Moses kept leading. There was no dramatic speech there, just obedience continuing. That may be one of the quietest miracles in the whole story. He kept going. After the golden calf, after the complaints, after the spies, after the sentence of 40 years. Moses kept rising in the morning and carrying the burden of the people. He kept receiving instructions. He kept judging disputes. He kept praying. He kept standing between God and Israel, and between Israel and its own self-destruction. Then came the rebellion of Korah. Korah was from the tribe of Levi. He gathered Dathan and Abiram from the tribe of Reuben and others with them, 250 chiefs of the congregation, well-known men. They came against Moses and Aaron and said the whole congregation was holy. Why, then, did Moses and Aaron exalt themselves over the assembly? It sounded almost spiritual. That is the danger of it. The words used holiness as a weapon against God's appointed order. They took a truth, that the congregation belonged to God, and twisted it into a challenge against the roles God himself had given. When Moses heard it, he fell on his face. Again. How many times had Moses fallen on his face by now? Before judgment, before rebellion, before grief. It was the posture of a man who knew that the situation was too dangerous for mere argument. He told Korah and his company that God would show who belonged to him. They were to bring censers. Aaron would bring his. The Lord would choose. Moses also sent for Dathan and Abiram, but they refused to come. They accused Moses of bringing them out of a land flowing with milk and honey to kill them in the wilderness. Egypt, the land of slavery, had now been renamed in their memory as the land of milk and honey. That is how distorted bitterness had become. The next day, the men stood with censers at the tent of meeting. The glory of the Lord appeared. Moses warned the congregation to move away from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Then the earth opened. The rebels went down alive into the grave, and the earth closed over them. Fire came out and consumed the 250 men offering incense. It was terrible. And still, the very next day, the people grumbled against Moses and Aaron, accusing them of killing the Lord's people. A plague began. Moses told Aaron to take his censer and make atonement. Aaron ran into the midst of the assembly. He stood between the dead and the living, and the plague was stopped. Between the dead and the living. That is where Moses and Aaron had spent so much of their lives. To settle the question of priesthood, God commanded that staffs from the tribal leaders be placed before him, one for each tribe, with Aaron's staff among them. The staff of the man God chose would sprout. The next day, Aaron's staff had not only sprouted, it had budded, blossomed, and produced ripe almonds. A dead piece of wood had borne life in the presence of God. It was kept as a sign, a quiet sign, after so much noise. Life comes from God's choosing, not human grasping. More years passed. The wilderness generation grew older. Children who had been carried out of Egypt became adults who knew only the road, the manna, the cloud, the stories of Pharaoh, and the graves of their parents. Miriam died at Kadesh and was buried there. Then there was no water. Again, the people gathered against Moses and Aaron. Again they asked why they had been brought into the wilderness. Again they spoke as though death would have been better. Again the burden pressed on Moses in the old familiar way. Moses and Aaron went from the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces. The glory of the Lord appeared. God told Moses to take the staff and speak to the rock before the eyes of the people, and it would yield water. Speak to the rock. Moses took the staff. He and Aaron gathered the assembly before the rock. But something in Moses, worn down by years of rebellion and complaint, came out in anger. "Hear now, you rebels," he said. "Must we bring water for you out of this rock?" Then Moses lifted his hand and struck the rock with his staff. Twice. Water came out abundantly. The congregation drank. Their livestock drank. The mercy of God still flowed. But Moses had disobeyed. He had been told to speak, and he struck. He had stood before the people in anger, and in that moment he did not uphold the holiness of God before their eyes. The water came because God was merciful to the people, but Moses was told that he would not bring the assembly into the land. This is one of the most painful sentences in his story. After everything, after Egypt, after Pharaoh, after the sea, after Sinai, after intercession upon intercession, after decades of leading a people who had exhausted him again and again, Moses would see the land, but he would not enter it. The place was called Meribah because the people quarreled with the Lord, and through it God showed himself holy. Moses kept leading. There was no dramatic speech there, just obedience continuing, even after that. That is worth noticing. He did not enter bitterness. He did not walk away. He did not say that if he could not have the end of the journey, he would not serve the people on the way to it. He kept going. With a future loss now fixed before him, he continued to guide the very people who would receive what he would only see from a distance. Soon after, Moses sent messengers to the king of Edom asking permission to pass through his land. He appealed to kinship, because Edom descended from Esau and Israel from Jacob. He promised not to pass through fields or vineyards, not to drink from wells without payment. But Edom refused and came out with a strong force. Israel turned away. The road lengthened again. At Mount Hor, Aaron's time came. God told Moses to take Aaron and Eleazar, his son, up the mountain. Aaron would be gathered to his people there because he would not enter the land. Moses obeyed. The three of them climbed in the sight of the congregation. Moses removed the priestly garments from Aaron and placed them on Eleazar. The priesthood passed from father to son on the mountain. Then Aaron died there. Moses came down with Eleazar. Aaron did not come down. And when the congregation saw that Aaron had died, all the house of Israel mourned for him 30 days. Moses had lost his sister. Now he had lost his brother. The people who had begun the journey with him were disappearing one by one. The wilderness was taking the generation, exactly as God had said. And Moses, who had carried them for so long, kept walking among their children. The road led around Edom, and the people became impatient. They spoke against God and Moses. They complained about the bread. They despised the manna again. Then fiery serpents came among the people, and many were bitten and died. The people came to Moses and confessed that they had sinned by speaking against the Lord and against him. They asked him to pray, and Moses prayed. Again, after all the accusations, all the weariness, all the repeated contempt, when the people asked for prayer, Moses prayed. God told him to make a bronze serpent and set it on a pole. Whoever was bitten could look at it and live. So Moses made it, a strange sign, a lifted image of the very thing that had wounded them. Not a charm, not magic, a visible act of trust in the word God had given. The bitten person looked, believing that God would heal as he had said, and lived. The journey continued through the wilderness toward the plains of Moab. There were battles. The king of Arad, Sihon, king of the Amorites, Og, king of Bashan. Israel, the people who had once trembled before the inhabitants of Canaan, now saw fortified kings defeated before them. The children of the generation that refused the land were being prepared to enter it. Then Balak, king of Moab, saw Israel camped near him and was afraid. He sent for Balaam, a diviner, to curse Israel. This part of the story happens mostly away from Moses' direct sight, but it belongs to the story of Moses because it shows what was happening above and around Israel while they were simply camped in the plains. Balak wanted them cursed. Balaam was summoned to speak against them. But God would not allow the curse. Again and again Balaam opened his mouth and blessing came out. From the heights, looking down at the tents of Israel, he saw what Balak could not see. A people ordered by tribes. A people blessed by God. A future that could not be undone by the fear of a foreign king. No curse could stick where God had placed blessing. But Israel's danger did not always come from outside. At Peor, the people were drawn into idolatry and immorality with the women of Moab and Midian. They joined themselves to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord burned. A plague came. Judgment fell. Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, acted with zeal, and the plague was stopped. The wilderness generation was almost gone, but the human heart had not become simpler. Moses was commanded to take another census. This was a new counting for a new moment. The first generation counted in the wilderness had fallen, except for Caleb and Joshua. Now their children were numbered on the edge of the land. Names were recorded. Families, clans, inheritance lines. The land ahead was not an abstraction now. It would be divided. Fields would belong to families. The promise would become soil under feet. In this season, the daughters of Zelophehad came forward. Their father had died in the wilderness, and he had no sons. They stood before Moses, Eleazar, the chiefs, and all the congregation at the entrance of the tent of meeting. They asked why their father's name should disappear from his clan simply because he had no son. They asked for an inheritance among their father's brothers. Moses brought their case before the Lord. He did not dismiss them. He did not answer from habit. He brought the matter to God. And God said the daughters were right. Their inheritance was secured, and a broader principle was given for Israel's life in the land. This is Moses again at his best, a leader with immense authority, still willing to listen, still willing to bring a question before God rather than pretend he already knows everything. The road had made him old, but it had not made him careless. Then the Lord told Moses to go up into the mountain of Abarim and see the land that he had given to the children of Israel. After he had seen it, he too would be gathered to his people, as Aaron had been. Moses knew what that meant, and his first recorded concern was not for himself. He asked God to appoint a man over the congregation, someone who would go out before them and come in before them, who would lead them out and bring them in, so that the congregation of the Lord would not be like sheep without a shepherd. Sheep without a shepherd. That was what Moses feared for them. Not dying outside the land. Not the personal ache of seeing and not entering. The people. Who would lead them? God told him to take Joshua, a man in whom was the Spirit, and lay his hand on him. Moses was to set him before Eleazar the priest and before all the congregation, commissioning him in their sight. Some of Moses' authority would be placed on Joshua, so the people would obey. Moses did as the Lord commanded. He laid his hands on Joshua, the assistant who had gone with him partway up Sinai, the young man who had lingered near the tent of meeting, the spy who, with Caleb, had trusted God when the people were afraid. Joshua would lead them in. Moses would not be the one to cross the Jordan at their head, but he would make sure they had a shepherd when he was gone. There was still more to do. God commanded Moses to take vengeance on Midian because of the matter of Peor. Israel went to war, and the campaign was completed. The tribes of Reuben and Gad, seeing that the lands east of the Jordan were good for livestock, asked to settle there. At first, Moses thought they were repeating the old sin of discouraging the people from entering the land. He remembered Kadesh. He remembered the spies. He remembered 40 years of graves. But they promised to cross armed with their brothers and help secure the land before returning to their families east of the Jordan. Moses accepted the promise and gave instructions accordingly. He was still guarding the heart of the nation from the old fear. Then, on the plains of Moab, across the Jordan from Jericho, Moses began to speak. Deuteronomy is the sound of Moses at the end of his life. Not the young man in Egypt, not the fugitive in Midian, not the reluctant shepherd at the bush. An old man now, a prophet, a leader, a servant who has carried the words of God for 40 years and is about to hand the people to another. He speaks to the children of the wilderness generation, to those who are about to receive what their parents feared. He does not merely repeat laws. He retells the story. He reminds them where they have been. He reminds them what the Lord has done. He tells them how God carried them as a man carries his son, through all the way they went until they came to that place. He reminds them of Sinai, of the refusal at Kadesh, of the long circling around Seir, of the victories east of the Jordan. He remembers the failures plainly. He remembers the mercy plainly too. That is how Moses teaches at the end, with memory, because a people who forgets the road will not know how to live in the gift. He tells them to listen. Hear, O Israel. the Lord is one. They are to love the Lord their God with all their heart, all their soul, and all their might. These words are to be on their hearts. They are to teach them diligently to their children, to speak of them sitting in the house and walking by the way, lying down and rising up. In other words, the covenant is not only for the mountain, it is for ordinary life, for doorways, for roads, for mornings, for evenings, for children asking why this way of life is different from the nations around them. Moses warns them about prosperity. This is one of the tender and frightening insights of Deuteronomy. Moses knows that hunger tested them in the wilderness, but abundance will test them in the land. Houses they did not build, wells they did not dig, vineyards and olive trees they did not plant. When they eat and are full, they must not forget the Lord who brought them out of Egypt. Need can make people cry out. Fullness can make people forget. Moses knew both dangers. He tells them that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. He explains the manna backward, as old people sometimes explain hardship after years have given it shape. God humbled them, fed them with what they did not know, taught them dependence one morning at a time. The manna had not only kept them alive, it had trained them. He reminds them that they were not chosen because they were larger or more impressive than other nations. They were chosen because the Lord loved them and kept the oath made to their fathers. The story began in promise, and it would continue by grace. Moses sets before them blessing and curse, life and good, death and evil. He urges them to choose life, not because obedience is a dry list of rules, but because life with God is life. To love him, to listen to his voice, to hold fast to him. This is their life and length of days. He speaks of kings, priests, prophets, justice, worship, mercy for the poor, fairness in judgment, care for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. He teaches them how to live as a people who remember that they were once slaves in Egypt. Their laws are shaped by memory. Because they knew oppression, they must not become oppressors. Because they were rescued, they must live as rescued people. Again and again he says, remember. Remember that you were slaves. Remember the Lord your God. Remember the wilderness. Remember what happened when your hearts turned away. Remember that you are not sustaining yourself. Memory, for Moses, is not nostalgia. It is survival. God then told Moses that the time of his death was near. Moses and Joshua presented themselves at the tent of meeting. The Lord appeared in the pillar of cloud. He spoke of Israel's future unfaithfulness, of the dangers that would come after Moses was gone. A song was given to Moses, a witness that Israel would carry in its memory. So Moses wrote the song and taught it to the people. He spoke words about the greatness of God, the rock whose work is perfect, whose ways are justice. He remembered God's care for Israel in the wilderness like an eagle stirring up its nest, hovering over its young, spreading its wings and carrying them. He warned of the danger of growing fat and forgetting. He placed the future before them in poetry, because songs can survive in a people long after ordinary speeches fade. When Moses finished speaking all the words of the song, he told the people to take them to heart. These were not empty words. They were their life. Not empty words. Their life. Then Moses blessed the tribes of Israel. One by one, he spoke over them. Reuben, Judah, Levi, Benjamin, Joseph, Zebulun, Issachar, Gad, Dan, Naphtali, Asher. Words shaped by tribe and future, spoken by the man who had carried them all. The blessing has the feel of farewell, because that is what it is. Moses is no longer arguing with Pharaoh or confronting rebels or pleading on Sinai. He is blessing the people he is about to leave. There is a gentleness in that. After all they had cost him. After all they had said. After all the complaints and rebellions and grief, he blesses them. Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, opposite Jericho. He was 120 years old. His eye was not dim. His strength had not fled. He climbed the mountain still himself, still Moses, still the servant of the Lord. From there, God showed him the land, Gilead as far as Dan, Naphtali, Ephraim and Manasseh, the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negev, the plain, the valley of Jericho, the city of palms, as far as Zor. Moses saw it, the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the land he had spoken of for 40 years, the land that had pulled the people forward through hunger and thirst and war and discipline. He saw it with his own eyes, but he did not cross over. There is sorrow there, and the Bible does not erase it. Moses had asked to go over. He had pleaded at one point to see the good land beyond the Jordan. But God had told him not to speak of the matter again. Moses accepted what was given. He would see, but not enter. And perhaps there is a mercy even in that seeing. God did not let him die with the promise only imagined. He let him look upon it. Let his eyes travel over hills and valleys his feet would never touch. Let him know that the journey had not been pointless. The children were there. The river was there. Jericho was there. The land was real. Moses had brought them to the edge. Joshua would bring them in. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. God buried him in the valley, and no one knows his grave to this day. That is one of the quietest endings in Scripture. No monument built by Israel. No tomb for pilgrims to visit. No grave to become a shrine. The Lord himself buried Moses, and the place was hidden. The man who had stood before Pharaoh and split the sea by God's command, the man who had climbed into cloud and spoken with God as with a friend, the man whose face had shone with reflected glory, was laid to rest by God in a place no one could turn into an idol. Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. 30 days of mourning for the man who had led them since before many of them were born. The man who had prayed when they sinned, cried out when they suffered, judged their disputes, carried their complaints, rebuked their rebellion, and blessed them before he died. Then the days of weeping ended. Joshua son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom, because Moses had laid his hands on him. The people listened to Joshua and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. The story continued. That matters. Moses died. The promise did not. The servant was buried. The covenant remained. The leader was gone. The presence of God continued before the people. And the scripture says that there has not arisen a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. None like him for the signs and wonders, for the mighty hand and the great deeds of terror that God sent him to do in Egypt before Pharaoh and all his servants and all his land. But the deepest greatness of Moses was not only that he stood before kings, it was that he stood before God for the people, again and again, when they were afraid, when they were thirsty, when they were guilty, when they were angry with him, when they deserved judgment. Moses went back to God. He pleaded. He asked. He listened. He came down again. He kept carrying the words. He kept walking the road. His life had begun under a death sentence, hidden by a mother who believed there was something worth saving in the child she held. He had been placed among reeds in a basket lined against the water. He had been drawn out of the Nile by Pharaoh's daughter and raised in the very house that had ordered children like him to die. He had fled after killing an Egyptian. He had sat by a well in Midian with no kingdom, no people, and no plan. He had married, shepherded, aged, and perhaps thought the great questions of his life were behind him. Then God spoke from a bush that burned without being consumed. Moses turned aside. That small turning changed everything. He turned aside to see. And the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob called his name. From that moment on, his life was no longer his own in the ordinary way. It was caught up into deliverance, into confrontation, into miracle, into the long, difficult work of forming a people in the wilderness. He learned that obedience does not always make the first step easier. He learned that freedom can frighten people who have lived too long in slavery. He learned that miracles do not automatically create trust. He learned that leadership can be lonely, even when you are surrounded by thousands. He learned that God is merciful and holy, near and dangerous, patient and not to be treated lightly. He learned that presence is better than success. If your presence does not go with us, do not send us from here. That was Moses' wisdom, At the end of all the signs and speeches and judgments and journeys, that is the sentence that still carries the center of his life. Not simply, give us the land. Not simply, remove our enemies. Not simply, make the road easier. Go with us. Be with us. Do not send us anywhere without you. And God went with them. Cloud by day, fire by night, glory in the tabernacle, mercy after failure, bread in the morning, water in dry places, a voice from the mountain, a promise beyond the river. Now, as this story comes to rest, imagine the view from Nebo in the quiet. The old prophet stands with the wind moving around him. Below, the plains of Moab stretch toward the Jordan. Beyond the river, the land rises and opens. Hills in the distance, valleys folded with shadow, the city of palms, the promise lying under the evening light. Moses looks. He sees enough. Not everything, but enough. Enough to know that God has been faithful. Enough to know that the road had a destination. Enough to know that the children will cross. The story of Moses is not the story of a man who received every earthly thing he longed for. It is the story of a man who was met by God, used by God, corrected by God, sustained by God, and finally taken by God. A man drawn out of the water. A man sent back into Egypt. A man who walked through the sea. A man who climbed the mountain. A man who carried the burden. A man who saw the land from a distance. A servant. A prophet. A friend. Moses rests now. The wilderness is quiet. The tents are still. The cloud that led them has not vanished from the story. The God who led him has not changed. The same presence that met him in flame, covered him in cloud, and buried him in secret remains the true center of the road. And you can rest here too. Let the room become quiet like the plains of Moab after the mourning days were complete. Let the night be still like the desert after the campfires have burned low. Let your breathing slow. You do not have to cross every river tonight. You do not have to solve every future thing before morning. Moses only walked the step that was given to him, from the basket, to the palace, to the wilderness, to the bush, to Pharaoh, to the sea, to Sinai, to the long road, to Nebo, step by step. The presence was enough for the step, and the presence is enough here. The God who heard Israel's groaning hears the quiet prayers no one else hears. The God who saw a child hidden in a basket sees what feels small and fragile in you. The God who made a way through the sea can make a way through what feels closed. The God who gave bread in the wilderness knows what you need before morning. So let the story settle. Let the burden loosen. Let the night hold what you cannot keep holding. The servant has finished his road. The promise continues. The Lord is still near. Sleep well.